Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Cleopatra is one of the most enchanting figures in all of history, not just for her alleged beauty, but for her famed intelligence and charm. Today, we'll talk about Cleopatra's life and then talk about what she really looked like, before revealing facial reconstructions of her appearance. So let's go ahead and get started. Cleopatra's Egypt was a very different place from the ancient Egypt we usually imagine. We are 1,500 years removed from the temples of Hatshepsut and the grand tomb of King Tut. In fact, the Great Pyramids were built 2,500 years before Cleopatra's birth, and by that time, only the head of the Sphinx would have been visible, as the rest was still buried. Cleopatra was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded in 305 BCE by the Macedonian Greek Ptolemy, a general and friend of Alexander the Great's. Much of Cleopatra's early life remains a mystery. She was born around 70 BCE to her father Ptolemy XII and her mother, likely Cleopatra V Tryphena. Though they respected local culture and adopted Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Ptolemies remained culturally Greek, and they moved Egypt's capital from Memphis to Alexandria. Unfortunately, one thing the Ptolemies were very happy to preserve from ancient Egyptian culture was the marrying of brothers and sisters. And as a result, her parents were very closely related, making her family tree very convoluted. Luckily for Cleopatra and her sisters, Arsinoe and Berenike, Ptolemaic Egypt was progressive for women. As a result, they received exceptional educations in literature, including Homer, military history, specifically Alexander the Great, public speaking, math, and more. Cleopatra also took it upon herself to learn the Old Egyptian language, something that none of her other relatives, despite it being the native language of the country they ruled, had bothered to do. But growing up in this royal family was not as easy as it may have seemed. In fact, you were lucky to survive to adulthood, not for the usual reasons like illness, but because it wasn't unusual for another family member to try to murder you for power. When she was 10, Cleopatra's father, Pharaoh Ptolemy XII, was forced to visit Rome to pay homage, aka beg to keep his throne. During this time, her elder sister Berenike declared herself queen, only to be overthrown again by their father 3 years later with the help of the Romans. Berenike was swiftly executed. As the more trusted siblings, Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII were named the future co-rulers of the land of Egypt. When their father died 5 years later in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was officially made the Queen of Egypt at the age of 18, marrying her full brother, Ptolemy. 8 years older than her brother husband, Cleopatra immediately disregarded him, placing herself on coinage and unilaterally making decisions. By the end of the year, official documents were listing Cleopatra as Egypt's sole ruler. But her reign as queen was difficult. She had inherited a massive debt from her father, owing the Romans 17 million drachma, which is approximately $750 million today, and had also inherited famine and unrest. These problems meant that Cleopatra was not a popular figure, and although she cleared the debt, she was for a time forced to flee to Roman Syria. While she was gone, her brother attempted to consolidate his own power, but made one critical mistake. As mentioned in our recent Julius Caesar video, Ptolemy XIII made the decision to assassinate Julius Caesar's greatest political enemy, Pompey, as he fled for refuge in Alexandria. Ptolemy, of course, was hoping to garner Julius Caesar's favor, but it did not have the effect that he desired. Caesar, now the most powerful man in Rome, was devastated by Pompey's death and extremely angry that a Roman consul had died at the hands of an Egyptian. He decided he was done with the unrest in Egypt and simply took up residence at the royal palace there, unofficially placing Egypt under Roman occupation and demanding that the young pharaoh Ptolemy disband his army. This is the part of the story where we truly begin to experience Cleopatra as a woman and as a ruler, with all of her intelligence, wit, and charm. Too often is Cleopatra depicted as simply a seductress who conveniently used her charms to subdue the powerful men around her. Let's remember that Cleopatra had grown up almost constantly in danger. It's hard to even imagine what that would feel like. But it was this same upbringing that prepared her for the hostile world she lived in. She learned how to read people, how to use people, how to charm her enemies, and how to lie or sabotage. During her teen years, she learned how to survive, never allowing her personal feelings to get in the way of what needed to be done. Cleopatra is one of those women in history with an absolute it factor. It's hard to say how beautiful Cleopatra was. Historical accounts disagree, but it's clear that she had a mesmerizing personality. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra wasted no time making acquaintances with the most powerful man in Rome. While legend has it that Cleopatra had herself rolled into a carpet and delivered at the feet of Caesar, it was more likely that she was carried in a sack by a servant into his presence. However she arrived, it's safe to say her entrance made an impression. Caesar was impressed by her boldness and ambition, and while we don't have the details of this meeting, we do know it kicked off a long-term alliance and legendary love affair between Caesar and Cleopatra. It's hard to say just how emotionally tied Cleopatra felt to the 51-year-old Caesar, but it was clear that they had a lot in common. Caesar was extremely intelligent and worldly, something that seemed to be matched by Cleopatra. Both of them also had a wild side. Their party cruises down the Nile were spectacles that went from dusk till dawn. While the relationship helped Cleopatra stay in power, the people of Egypt were not happy with their queen being seen as the lapdog of Rome, leading to a brief civil war. It's important to remember what a difficult situation Cleopatra was tasked with here. She was competing with a brother and a sister for the throne. She had to keep peace in a kingdom where an elite group of Greeks ruled a land that was culturally and linguistically different from them. And she had to balance the needs of Egypt with the looming threat of Rome. Her seduction of Julius Caesar was not only necessary, but was a truly masterful move that couldn't have been done by just anyone. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra's brother, husband, and rival, Ptolemy XIII, was eventually killed after being defeated in battle, drowning in the Nile while trying to flee. Her other sister, Arsinoe IV, had also attempted to take the throne during this time, but was arrested and exiled by the Romans before she could do any real damage. After this series of conflicts, it was a time of relative safety and stability for Cleopatra and her kingdom. At the suggestion of Julius Caesar, Cleopatra officially married her second brother, also named Ptolemy, although this was mostly for the optics of Egypt having a male co-ruler. Everyone understood that in reality, it was Cleopatra and Caesar who were truly in power. By September of 48 BCE, Cleopatra was pregnant with Julius Caesar's child. On the 23rd of June, 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son named Ptolemy Caesar, and they affectionately called the boy Caesarion, which means Little Caesar. Biographer Barry Strauss calls the addition of Caesar to the name a brilliant act of flattery by Cleopatra. Their alliance had turned out to be an immensely profitable one for Cleopatra. She had secured an heir to the throne, one that would unite the interests of both Egypt and Rome. Soon, Cleopatra traveled to Rome to speak for her son to be named Caesar's official heir and to stay close to her lover. The citizens of Rome had become equally fascinated and terrified of Cleopatra. According to Karen Acton, the Romans were so xenophobic as a people that Cleopatra, being a female ruler and queen of this exotic foreign land, was scary to them. She was drawn up in Roman culture as the anti-Roman woman. While the ideal Roman woman should be obedient, chaste, and quiet, Cleopatra was the opposite. But they were fascinated by her way of speaking and her manner of dress. Cleopatra began to strongly align herself visually with the goddess Isis, the goddess of motherhood, femininity, and wisdom. She would dress like Isis at public events in Rome to remind everyone that she was the mother of Caesar's heir. However, while Cleopatra was lodging in Caesar's villa just across the Tiber River, disaster struck. It was March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March. Julius Caesar had been stabbed to death in the Roman Senate building. Cleopatra knew what a dire situation this was, but she was a woman to always keep calm in a crisis. When his will was read out, Cleopatra had hoped that Caesar would recognize their son as his heir, but he did not. His adopted nephew, Octavian, would instead succeed him. Quietly, Cleopatra left Rome. Unsure as to what this shift in Roman power would mean for her country, she had to be ready. Her official husband, her brother Ptolemy XIV, was soon poisoned, no doubt at the hand of his sister Cleopatra, and Caesarion was officially elevated to co-monarch with his mother. Cleopatra had been left with no allies. Rome had turned on her, and despite the civil war currently raging in their republic, she knew their eyes would return to Egypt eventually. Back in Rome, Octavian, who is later known as Augustus, was inheriting his own fraught political situation, trying to stabilize an extremely shaky Rome, and vying for power against one of Caesar's generals, Marc Antony. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra received a summons. It was from Marc Antony, now one of the most prominent leaders in Rome. Antony was known to be handsome, a womanizer, and a legendary party boy. But even with all of his flaws, he was extremely charismatic, skilled at politics, and respected by his armies. In a way, he and Cleopatra had a lot in common. The two had probably crossed paths before, but Cleopatra knew that now was the time to make a real impression. She knew exactly how to play to his weaknesses. So she arrived on the golden royal barge of Egypt in all her glory, wearing the finest clothing and most elaborate jewelry possible. Her servants were dressed like the goddess Venus. Scented smoke billowed behind the barge, which was reportedly moving very slowly thanks to Cleopatra reducing the number of rowers to half. She succeeded in making a glorious spectacle, one that Marc Antony would not be able to resist. Soon, the two were lovers, and Cleopatra had a new, powerful ally. Antony was so enchanted that he followed her to Alexandria, even though his situation in Rome was by no means stable, and the two spent the next few years partying in all of her wealth and splendor. Antony's military exploits, backed with Cleopatra's wealth, had helped repair the broken Egyptian empire, and together they had restored territories that the Ptolemies had lost over the years. Cleopatra soon gave birth to twins, Cleopatra Selene and Alexander. And later, another son came along, Ptolemy. All of the children were acknowledged formally by Antony and given incredible lands and wealth of their own. In 40 BCE, Antony was forced to return to Rome to marry Octavia, the older sister of Octavian, a politically motivated marriage to keep the peace between the two men. Octavia was Cleopatra's polar opposite, and the union was used almost as a way to shame him into behaving like a respectable Roman man. But Antony's appetite for travel and partying could not be satisfied as the obedient husband of a respectable Roman woman. He was soon back in Egypt by Cleopatra's side. Octavian had officially had it with Marc Antony. He was absent from politics most of the time, drinking, partying, and embarrassing Octavian's sister. To make matters worse, Antony was convincing people in Rome to support Cleopatra and Caesar's son, Caesarion, as the rightful heir over Octavian. It was a threat that Octavian could not ignore. Octavian began a brutal propaganda war against Cleopatra and Antony. He published Marc Antony's will for all to see, which stated that a huge chunk of Roman land would be passed to Cleopatra and their children after his death, enraging the Roman elite. Octavian claimed that Cleopatra was a witch who was enchanting Antony, trying to get him to make Rome into a province of Egypt and not the other way around. He soon declared war on Marc Antony and Cleopatra, and it all came to a head at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. This battle was the climax of over a decade of rivalry between two men that Caesar had loved and trusted. While Cleopatra and Antony had gathered a respectable amount of ships, more than Octavian, they were heavier and less maneuverable than Octavian's quick fleet. When a trusted comrade betrayed Antony and gave Augustus his plans, Antony knew his fate was sealed. Although he put up a fight, his slower force lost the battle decisively. In the spring of 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt, swiftly conquering its territories, and soon was knocking on Alexandria's door. Realizing his fate, Antony officially surrendered to Octavian. While we don't know if it evolved into genuinely true love between Cleopatra and Antony, there's no doubt that Cleopatra initially got involved with him as a means to protect Egypt. Antony's surrender to Augustus effectively handed Egypt over to Rome, leaving Cleopatra with nothing but feelings of betrayal. Legend has it that while hiding in a tomb with her close attendants, Cleopatra had a messenger deliver a note to Antony, stating that she was already dead. Either heartbroken or just simply broken after the military losses, Antony committed suicide. Octavian had already occupied the palace and seized Cleopatra's 3 children with Antony. Cleopatra knew that Octavian intended to capture her and parade her through Rome, no doubt to brag about his military victories. She told him, "I will not be led in a triumph." These words are one of the rare instances of Cleopatra's exact words being recorded. Instead of being paraded around Rome, Cleopatra decided to end her life on her own terms. At the age of 39, legend has it that Cleopatra died from the bite of a poison asp. In reality, she likely died from eating poison hemlock, laid out on a bed with 2 of her most loyal ladies-in-waiting. Marc Antony and Cleopatra were buried together in Egypt, although the location of their tomb is currently lost to history. Her son, Caesarion, Caesar's last true blood relative, reigned for a mere 18 days before being captured and executed on the orders of Octavian. With the fall of the last Ptolemaic queen, Egypt was taken by the Romans. Cleopatra's legacy is fascinating and complex. While the records we have of her come through Roman eyes, we can still see the truth. She was a ruthlessly intelligent queen, a fierce supporter of her people, and a woman who seemed to always know how to get what she wanted. And as a result, Cleopatra's life has been seared into our popular imaginations. So, what did Cleopatra really look like? Like her history, some of Cleopatra's appearance is shrouded in mystery, but has always maintained a curiosity thanks to her seductive reputation. We only have notes about Cleopatra from Roman sources, so unfortunately there are no contemporary Egyptian accounts of her looks, which might be why this fierce debate still rages today. Plutarch remarked that her beauty was in itself not altogether incomparable, but then also says that she was conscious of her personal beauty and was intensely proud of it. Cassius Dio said she was a woman of surpassing beauty, and at that time, when she was in the prime of her youth, she was most striking. But keep in mind that neither of these men saw Cleopatra in person. They were writing over 100 years after her death. Luckily, we do actually have a lot of images of Cleopatra from her lifetime. She had many coins minted in her image that still survive today. And we have several Roman statues that have captured her likeness. They all show a woman with full lips, a strong sloping nose, large expressive eyes, and a small forehead. It's most fortunate for us that the Roman statues exist, because during the late Republic period, Roman sculpture was particularly realistic. The Egyptian portrayals of Cleopatra are more symbolic and were not meant to be realistic. And new discoveries are coming all the time. In fact, just in the past few weeks, a new statue head has been unearthed near Taposiris Magna, Cleopatra's rumored burial site, by archaeologist Kathleen Martinez. But we'll have to wait for a verdict on this one. Scholars are currently in the midst of arguing if this truly depicts her, since it doesn't really resemble her other statues. Even if Cleopatra was not the most physically beautiful woman, it is certain that her overall splendor made an impression. In clothing, Cleopatra created a fascinating blend of Egyptian and Greek fashions, also incorporating Roman influence. She would adorn herself with dark red and purple cloth and as much gold jewelry and gemstones as possible. I've taken real Greek jewelry and added it to my recreations. She famously wore the Hellenistic-style diadem. and a hairstyle called the melon hairstyle most of the time. She would use makeup to accentuate her features, kohl smudged around her eyes, and plant dyes used for blush and lipstick. What we don't know for sure, and a subject of much debate, is Cleopatra's exact ethnic background. In truth, though, Cleopatra is one of the least ethnically ambiguous figures in history. We know for a fact that she was descended for hundreds of years through the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, with very clear ancestry records. And as we know from the history portion, the inbreeding in this family was insane, and didn't leave much room for outside genetics to come in. There are a few question marks in Cleopatra's lineage, and one is her mother. While she was most likely Queen Cleopatra V Tryphena, we don't have a solid record of it anywhere. However, if Cleopatra was the child of a concubine, she would have been considered a bastard, and there would have been remarks about this made, so it seems unlikely. While it's technically possible that Cleopatra was mixed with sub-Saharan African genes, it's much more likely that she's what we would consider a white Greek woman. And maybe she shared the same dark curly hair that we see in Greek populations today. But interestingly, it's been posited that she was a redhead, since several depictions of Cleopatra found in the city of Pompeii show her with vivid red hair. This could also be the result of wigs or henna dye, which Egyptians and Romans were very familiar with. I've used a Roman statue for my recreation, and of course keep in mind that this is just one way Cleopatra may have looked. So let's take a look at the face of Cleopatra now.